Well, I'm so glad you're here today. Open up your Bible to Philippians chapter 1, if you will. Just a couple weeks ago, we kicked off this new teaching series called Unshakable Joy. And what we're doing right now is we're going verse by verse through the book of Philippians. And Pastor Tony's taken us the last couple of weeks through the first about 10, 11 verses. And we're going to start into verse number 12 this morning. But I'm so glad that you're here. If you got a worship guide, flip it over the back side and you can follow along with the message today. And the topic today we're going to look at is advancing through adversity, how God takes the difficult times, the difficult days in our lives, and he continues to advance his work, advance his plan in our lives. I want to start by saying something this morning that we don't typically say, or we don't typically admit that we say out loud in church, and it's this. Most of us have thought this at some point in our lives, but we've probably never said it out loud, especially in church. There's days, there's weeks, maybe months, maybe even some seasons in your life and in my life where we look at our circumstances, we look at where we are at that moment in our life, and we say something like this: this is not what I'd hoped for. This is really not where I thought I would be at this point in my life. This is just really not what I'd hoped for. This is not where I had dreamed or I had imagined life would be right now. And maybe it was because of something like this. Maybe it was because of a diagnosis that you got at the doctor. Maybe it was an unexpected loss of your job and trying to find a new one, and that season seemed to be so difficult. Maybe it was the tension because of a breakup of a relationship, or maybe a breakup of a marriage. Maybe it was daily conflict that you find yourself in at work, and you're just wondering, is this ever going to get any better? Maybe it's a season of infertility that you've walked through and said, God, please bring this to an end. Maybe it's just a time of feeling heavy in your life, and you say, this is just not what I'd hoped for. And when those days hit, when those times hit, maybe even those seasons hit, most of us assume something like this: if God was really working, if God was really moving and God was really caring about me, this wouldn't be happening right now. Now, maybe we don't say it out loud, but we've had days, we've had times, we've had seasons where we've thought that in our mind. Because somewhere along the line, we started believing this. We started believing that progress in our life always looks like progress. We assume that if God's working and God is moving in our lives, that it's always going to be forward. It's always going to be in a positive direction. Things should always be getting better and better in our life if God is loving, and if God is really caring, and if God is really watching over our life, then things should be always getting better, moving forward in a positive direction. Now, if you've ever felt that way, which I have, can I tell you that you're in good company this morning? There's a guy in the Bible by the name of David. David was a psalmist. He ended up being king over God's people. At one point in his life, David finds himself being chased by King Saul. King Saul intended to kill David. David's worn out. He's tired. He's exhausted. He's discouraged. And David writes Psalm chapter 13, and these are the words that come from a guy that was called a man after God's own heart. David said, "Oh Lord, how long will you forget me? Forever? How long will you look the other way? How long must I struggle with anguish in my soul, with sorrow in my heart every day?" Those are some heavy words from a guy that was called a man after God's own heart. Now, most of us, if we would be honest this morning, would say, I've had feelings like that before. I've had assumptions, at least, that maybe God had forgotten me, and maybe he didn't forget me, but maybe his attention was just someplace else in the world besides me. It was Friday, July 19th, 2024. Airports all around the globe began to shut down because of a major IT outage that was caused by a software update by Microsoft. Maybe you remember it. Millions of airport computers crashed, and what would later be known as the blue screen of death happened in airports all around the world. My wife and I were in Medford, Oregon when this happened. We had just checked in for a flight back to Atlanta, and this happened 10 minutes later. So we checked in, got our baggage, checked in, we were headed through security, and all this happened. Nothing was happening. Nothing was happening. It wasn't like, hey, things are just delayed a little bit. It wasn't like we're gonna give you some updates, no boarding in a little bit. Nothing. Screens went blank, flight stopped, no announcements, no answers, no updates, nothing. And the worst part that day, as I look back, was really not the waiting, although the waiting stunk. The worst part was not knowing what the waiting meant. What's going on? Is there something that we've missed here? Is this going to be temporary? Is this a permanent thing? Is there something going on that the airline employees haven't told us? What in the world does this mean and what's going on? Hours turned into more hours and turned into eventually an airline employee telling me, the best I could tell you is you're going to be here at least 5 days, maybe longer, but I can't even promise that. We're sitting in Medford, Oregon. That kind of emotional space, that kind of frustration, that kind of uncertainty, that's just a very little glimpse of what the Apostle Paul was feeling as he's writing the book of Philippians. He isn't delayed. He isn't inconvenienced. He's in prison. Things have stopped. Things haven't been delayed for him. Everything has come to a screeching halt. He's chained. He's guarded. He's waiting on a trial that could end his life. And there's a question that seems to be hanging over this entire letter of Philippians, and it's this. Has God's work through Paul and through God's people stalled? Or is there something else that's happening? Has God's work come to a screeching halt, or is there something else that God is trying to do? Let me give you a target statement for the message this morning. It's there on the top of your notes. This is what I think God wants to teach us. Adversity in our lives is not an interruption to God's plan. It's often the way that God advances it. Adversity, difficulty in our lives doesn't mean that God has stopped working. It doesn't mean that God's plan has stopped for your life. Many times that's the way that God advances his plan and his purpose in our lives. That's what we're going to learn from the passage. I want you to hear me say this today. Your feelings and your circumstances in your life are not a barometer for God's involvement or seemingly lack of involvement in your life. How you feel right now, the circumstances and the setbacks, it does not mean that God is not moving. It does not mean that God is not advancing his plan in your life just because of the way that you feel. Let's jump into Philippians chapter 1, beginning verse number 12. Paul says this, I want you to know, my dear brothers and sisters, that everything, if you circle in your Bible or in your notes, circle the word everything. I want you to know, my dear brothers and sisters, that everything that has happened to me has helped to spread the good news. Now circle the word everyone. He says, for everyone here, including the whole palace guard, knows that I'm in chains because of Christ. And because of my imprisonment, notice most of the believers here have gained confidence and boldly speak God's message without fear. Here's what I want us to see in verses 12, 13, and 14. It's this. God often uses what feels like a limitation to create influence. Many times in your life and in my life, what seems like a limitation, what seems like a difficulty, what seems like a stopping is God's way of creating influence for us in our lives. Notice Paul said this. He said, everything that has happened to me here has helped to spread the good news. When people looked at Paul, this is what they saw. When people saw him, they saw his chains. They saw his limitations. They saw that he was restricted. He had a loss of freedom. And that is what people saw when they looked at him. And Paul is writing from a Roman prison cell. And he says, hey, these chains, they seem like a limitation. They seem like a stopping of what God is trying to do in my life. But he said, God, because of these chains, God has given me influence where I am. Now, if I had been writing this letter, I probably wouldn't have been quite as optimistic as Paul. If I'd have been writing the letter, I'd have said, hey, it stinks where I am. I hate being here. These chains are so heavy. Despite where I am, one of these days when I get out of here, we're going to have a party. I mean, one of these days when it gets better, that's probably how I would have felt. But this is what Paul says. He said this limitation, this is what God is using in my life to give me influence. Now, I don't want you to miss this. What would happen is a prisoner would be chained up to a guard. They weren't just chained to a wall or to the floor. They were chained up to a guard. And so Paul is in prison here. He's chained to Roman guards, one after the other, shift after shift. A new guard would come in. They would unchain themselves and chain themselves up to Paul. Person after person, guard after guard would come in. And Paul does not see himself as stuck. Listen, don't miss this. Paul does not see himself as stuck with the guards. He sees the guards stuck with him. Don't miss this. The very people, listen, the very people that have been entrusted to keep watch on him and to shut him up about Jesus, they're having to listen about Jesus every day. The same people that are saying, no more of this talk about Jesus, are chained to him every single day, having to listen to him sing, having to listen to him share the gospel day after day. And Paul says, these chains might seem like a limitation, but God has given me influence. Paul said this, he said, everyone here, including the palace guard, know that I'm in chains. Why? Because of Christ. They're having to listen to it every day. That means the very people assigned to silence him are hearing about Jesus every day. Let me ask you, what about you? What things in your life you say, they're a limitation to me? They're holding me back. They're keeping me from where I want to be in life or what I thought would be by now. What places in your life feel like a limitation? Maybe it's an unfulfilling workplace, a hospital room, a season of caregiving for a family member, a strained relationship. And all of those places, listen, all of those places can feel limiting. But those are also places where conversations and relationships happen that might not happen otherwise. Some of the most meaningful spiritual conversations don't happen in church buildings. Did you know that? Some of the most incredibly spiritual conversations happen in places where maybe you never expected yourself to be, or maybe you didn't want to be, but God has you there for a reason. Paul says his chains did something unexpected. He said, because of my imprisonment, most of the believers here have gained confidence and boldly speak God's message without fear. Paul was saying this, my limitations, my suffering have given other people courage. Ask yourself this. What if instead of assuming that my limitations, my difficulties, what if instead of assuming that those limitations mean that God's not working, instead of that, what if I ask this question? God, how do you want to use me in the middle of these limitations? How do you want to use me right now? How do you want to use my life with these things that seem to be holding me back? Maybe ask this question, God, what would faithfulness look like for me right now in the season that I'm in? That's what Paul was saying. I can see these chains as something to hold me back, or I can see them as you giving me influence to make a difference for you. Let's keep reading. Verse number 15. Paul says it's true that some are preaching out of jealousy and rivalry, but others preach about Christ with pure motives. Skip down to verse 17. Those who do not have pure motives as they preach about Christ, they preach with selfish ambition, not sincerely, instead to make my chains more painful for me. But that doesn't matter. Circle those words, those 4 words, but that doesn't matter. Whether their motives are false or genuine, the message about Christ is being preached either way, so I rejoice. And I will continue to rejoice. Here's what I want us to see from verses 15 to 18. God can work even when motives are mixed. God can still work. God can still advance his plans even when our motives aren't exactly what they should be. In these verses here, Paul confronts an issue, and then right away he tells us how to respond, how to deal with it. Paul confronts the fact that not everybody, not every preacher, not every pastor that preaches about Jesus has pure motives and pure intentions. He mentions 2 different kinds of people here. The first are those that are preaching a true gospel, but they do it with the wrong motives. I mean, when they preach, they're preaching Jesus. Salvation through Jesus alone. He's the only way to get to heaven. I mean, they're preaching the true gospel, but they're doing it with wrong motives. Maybe they do it with envy or rivalry. Maybe they have some sort of selfish intent. Paul may have been referring to other preachers during that time period that saw themselves as competitors to Paul. Maybe they had some sort of resentment for Paul's influence. Maybe they wanted recognition that Paul was getting from the early church. Maybe they saw, hey, Paul's in prison. Now's our chance to step up and get a little more influence in the area while Paul's in prison. We see it today. We see it through preachers that maybe have motives that are for popularity, for wealth, for recognition. Maybe it's as subtle as pride. The idea of I want God to do big things, but I want God to do the big things all through me. Years ago, I was at a conference. And it was 4 pastors, and the pastor that was leading the conference, he asked this question to all the pastors that were in the room. He said, how many of you want to see God bring revival to your city where you are? Man, everybody raised their hand, everybody clapped, everybody was shaking their head, everybody was all about it. But then he asked this question. He said, how many of you want to see God bring revival to your city, even if he does it through another church besides yours? And there was an audible groan in the room because it revealed all of our motives. Yes, we want to see God do big things in our city, but we want him to do it through our church. And it reveals what our heart is, what our motive is. Now, Paul talks about a second group, and it's those that are preaching with pure motives. These people are preaching the gospel with love and with compassion, supporting the same mission that Paul was. But then Paul makes this very bold declaration here. He said, our God is very gracious and sovereign. And God can even take, don't miss this, God can even take bad, selfish motives to advance his mission of saving the world. Now, very quickly, let me tell you what Paul was not saying, okay? Paul was not saying that motives don't matter to God. That's not what he's saying here, because motives do matter. Paul was not saying that pastors can act selfishly without accountability. He was not saying that. He was not saying that false teaching should ever be tolerated. He was not saying that. Paul was saying this. Paul was saying that he had the ability to separate the truth of the message from the flaws of the messenger. The truth of the message from the flaws of the messenger. See, the gospel itself was not being distorted. So Paul says, we can take the flaws of those that are giving the message and still see the purpose that God has behind it. It reminds me of a stained glass window. If you've ever seen a stained glass window, they're beautiful. But did you know that a stained glass window is made up of lots and lots, hundreds, thousands of pieces of broken glass, shards of glass? And whoever the artist is or the person that puts it together puts all of those pieces of broken glass together. And the beauty is really not in all of the pieces of the broken glass. The beauty is when they're all put together and the light comes through. When the light comes through, that's what creates the beauty. And that's the example that I have in my head is we are flawed messengers. But when God brings us together, he can still take our flaws and all of our mess ups, and he can still use them to shine his message through. So Paul says God can take all of our flaws and use them for good. So how does that apply to us? Maybe you and I need to let go of comparison to other people. Maybe we need to learn to celebrate God's work in somebody else. Maybe we need to learn to celebrate when God's working in another church, when God's moving in other ways besides just in us. Maybe celebrate God's work when you don't get acknowledged. Celebrate what God's doing when you weren't involved. Celebrate when you're not the one up front, when you're not the one being noticed. You see, that kind of humility is what advances the gospel. This year, we're talking about joy. Don't miss this. Joy collapses. Don't miss this. Joy collapses when it rests on being noticed. Did you know that? When you only receive joy when what you did is noticed, then that collapses. That's no foundation. But joy flourishes when it rests on Christ being proclaimed, when Christ being glorified through me. What is your foundation? We got to keep reading. Verse number 20. Paul says, "For I fully expect and hope that I will never be ashamed, but that I will continue to be bold for Christ as I have been in the past. And I trust that my life will bring honor to Christ, whether I live or die. For me, living means living for Christ, and dying is even better." Here's what I want us to see in verses 20 and 21. Adversity has a way of clarifying what really matters. The difficulties that you walk through in life, the difficult times that you walk through, has a way of just making it clear what really matters in life. Paul says living means living for Christ. Dying, Paul says that's even better. Now, that's a very bold statement. That's something that takes maturity to be able to say. You don't just casually say that. That's not a slogan that you put on a t-shirt and wear it to the gym. That's a statement that comes from clarity that's been gained under pressure and through adversity. You see, trials and adversity strip away everything else in life that doesn't matter. Trials and adversity have a way of kind of knocking everything else off of the table and helping us understand what truly matters in life. When my son was a freshman in high school, he had a very horrendous ATV accident. He was riding in the ATV and it rolled over and nearly severed his left arm. I rushed out to the field where he was. And as I sat and laid there in the grass with him, holding his arm, trying to stop the bleeding while we waited on the EMS to come and eventually the life flight to come, all of that had a way of stripping away the things that didn't matter in life. And as we got in our car and the helicopter took him to Louisville, Kentucky, and we drove as fast as we could to Louisville, and during the first of those 5 surgeries to reattach his arm, can I tell you, we weren't thinking during that time about what kind of car we drove. We weren't thinking about how nice our house was or what kind of clothes we wore. We weren't thinking and caring about what was going on in the world with sports. We weren't watching TV. We weren't scrolling through social media. Because adversity and difficulty has a way of knocking everything else off the table to help you understand what's important. And it was during that time, we spent time caring about our son. We thought about family. We spent a lot of time praying. We had members of our church that loved us and cared for us in huge ways. And when life gets hard, you quickly learn what matters and what doesn't, what can hold you up and what can't. You see, pressure in life begins to reveal what your priorities are or they should be. Because adversity doesn't create what is on the inside, it just simply reveals it. You see, nobody goes through a crisis and on the other side says, I really wish I cared more about people's opinions. Or I really wish I cared more about what people thought about me. You don't come out of adversity saying that. I want you to do something with me. It's there on your notes, and I want you to take just a second. I want you to think really hard. Paul said, for me to live is Christ. I want you to honestly fill in the blank or fill it in your head. What is it for you? For me to live is what? What is it? For me to live is my job. For me to live is a bigger house. For me to live is my retirement. For me to live is relationships. For me to live is what? What is it? What is it in life that you're living for? And then ask yourself, if that thing were taken away, would my faith still stand? What are you building your life on? Because if Christ is your foundation, he's the only thing that will hold you up. Is Christ your foundation, or is he just an addition to your life? I want you to ask yourself that question. See, Paul teaches us here that adversity has a way of clarifying what really matters. Let's keep reading. Verse 23. Paul says, I'm torn between two desires. I long to go and be with Christ, which would be far better for me. But for your sakes, it's better that I continue to live. Knowing this, I'm convinced that I'll remain alive so I can continue to help all of you grow and experience the joy of your faith. Here's what I think Paul wants to teach us in 23, 24, and 25, and it's this. God advances his work through obedience, not through escape. God advances his work when we're obedient to him and we do what he asks us to do, not when we try to say, hey, I got to get out of this. I got to run from these adversities. No, just be obedient where God has you. At this point in Paul's life, as he writes this letter, his future is very uncertain. Death could be imminent, but God could step in and spare him. He doesn't know what the future holds. And that uncertainty, the imprisonment, it all has him thinking, what's next? What's coming next for me? Paul wholeheartedly believed what he told the church in Corinth. He said to be absent from this body means to be at home with the Lord. Paul believed that, he understood that, he preached that. And he knew that his eternal home was going to be in heaven, that was secure, and that ultimately, Paul says, would be better. But at this point, Paul says, God's not done with me. God still has work for me to do. And he says, while God still has me here, I'm going to continue to be obedient. I'm going to continue to help you experience joy. I'm going to continue to help you grow. Paul says, if I live, I'm going to keep serving. If I die, then I'm going to be with Christ. If you're anything like me, you want to know what's coming next. I don't like to just fly by the seat of my pants, man. I'm a planner. I like to know when we go on a trip, I like to know what's coming next, what town we're going to, where we're going to stay. I don't like uncertainty. And Paul says, there's lots of uncertainty out there. I don't know what's coming next. I don't like to live with that like that. I struggle with that. But Paul says, I'm going to choose to remain faithful. I'm just going to keep being obedient without knowing what is coming next. Listen to me. God rarely shows us the whole picture. Very rarely. God just says, take the next faithful step. Just be obedient today. Just be obedient tomorrow. Just keep taking that next obedient step. Sometimes obedience looks like this. It looks like staying when quitting would be easier. Sometimes obedience means forgiving when bitterness seems justified. Sometimes obedience means continues to serve when nobody else seems to notice. Sometimes obedience means praying when it seems like your answers are never coming. I want you to ask yourself this question. What step of obedience have I been postponing because it just feels uncomfortable? What has God been asking you to do? What's God been prompting you to do, but you just haven't done it? Let's look at the last verse this morning, verse number 27. Paul says this, above all, you must live as citizens of heaven. I love that. Conducting yourselves in a manner worthy of the good news about Christ. Then, whether I come and see you again or only hear about you, I'll know that you're standing together with one spirit and one purpose, fighting together for the faith, which is the good news. Here's what I want us to see out of verse number 27. It's this. Your response to adversity tells a story about Jesus. How you respond in adversity, that tells a story about Jesus to other people. The people of Philippi, they were obsessed with Roman citizenship. And Paul reminds them, he says, you, don't miss this, don't check out on me yet. Paul says, you represent a different kingdom. You're citizens of heaven. So act like it. All throughout the year, I see people and they wear a shirt or a jersey of their favorite team. And they go to games and they sport their favorite team. And I've seen people wearing jerseys or shirts of their favorite team and do really, really stupid things. And they get blasted on social media because they're representing their favorite team. I've seen people do very, very honorable things while wearing their favorite team, and they get recognized and people say, oh, look at that Tennessee fan doing something nice for a poor Georgia fan. And we wear things to represent our team. And Paul says this, you represent Christ. People are watching. You're a citizen of heaven. So act like it. About a week ago, I've told you before, I struggle sometimes in traffic, and I can let it get the best of me. About a week and a half ago, somebody got up real close behind me for a long time, and I was getting frustrated. And I could feel it just welling up inside of me. And I wanted to do the brake tap. I wanted to throw up my hands. As soon as we got to a little bit of an opening, they pulled up next to me and gave me the "You're number one" sign. And immediately, everything that was inside of me wanted to holler and scream and just lose it, because they'd been driving so erratic and could have caused a wreck. But I felt the Holy Spirit that lives inside of me say, you're a citizen of heaven. And as much as I wanted to, as much as my flesh wanted to lash out, I was reminded of what team I was representing. Paul, he reminds us, your story, your response, it tells people about Jesus. We're watching how you deal with adversity, how you express hope, how you express joy. Ask yourself, what story does my response tell people about Jesus? And the way that I carry myself in the community, what story does that tell? Let me tell you something. The season that you're walking through right now, it may not change immediately, but it doesn't have to be wasted. God can take the season that you're walking through right now and he can use it to advance his plan and his purpose. So God's not sidelined by your circumstances. Your hardships may be somebody else's encouragement. Advancement always looks like faithfulness, not necessarily success. God is still working right where you are. What if this season that you're walking through is not God stopping you, but it's God shaping you? What if God's doing more in you right now than what you could see? Just because it feels like a setback, it doesn't mean like God stopped. Those things that seem like limitations could be God giving you influence to reach somebody for Christ, to advance his plan and his purpose in your life.